All right, Yermosai. Good evening. A great schos Berachos to be back with all of you. And let us begin. So we left Rabbi Rechta when we got up to Tesvav Amud Aleph, the bottom. Does that sound correct? Yeah. 15 at the bottom. Good. So let's pick up from there. A really, really beautiful sugya ahead of us tonight in Meretz Hashem. So let's pick up 3 lines up from the bottom. Tanan Hasam. So we learned elsewhere. So the Gemara says as follows: Hakol Kshem Likros HaMegillah. Everyone is permitted to go ahead. And I also remember again the context of this discussion is the Mishnah that we had a little bit higher up on the page of Hakori Eshma Velo Eshmiya La'azno Yatza. Rabbi Yossi Omer Lo Yatza. Right. So if a person went ahead and read Shema and did not articulate the words in such a way in which they could hear that which they are saying, do they fulfill the obligation? Do they fulfill the mitzvah or not? So this is a fundamental machlokes. Or to say it a little bit simpler, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema, do you have to hear what it is that you're saying or not? That's the fundamental machlokes. So this topic that we're about to continue now on is kind of like a continuation of that conversation. So the Gemara says, Tan Hasam, Hakol Kshem Nikros HaMegillah. Everyone is permitted to go and read the Megillah. Chutz mecheresh shota v'katan, with the exception of a cheresh. Cheresh is someone who is deaf and mute. Shota, someone who is insane, lacks capacity. V'katan, and a minor. Common denominator amongst all three of these people is that they lack intellectual capacity. So the Gemara says, therefore, halacha l'maisa, they are not permitted to read the Megillah. Now, when we say they're not permitted to read the Megillah, it means they can't read the Megillah to be motzi someone else. Fine, Rabbi Yehuda Masher B'Katan. Rabbi Yehuda says that a katan, a minor, is permitted to go ahead and read the Megillah. So the Gemara says, Mantana cheresh de evenamilas. Well, says you have to understand something. So in the Gemara's model of a cheresh, of someone who is deaf and mute. So remember again, times of the Gemara, person who is deaf and mute, that's it. There's no communication. There's no learning, there's no ability. So therefore, again, the way halacha, the Gemara treats such a person like this is that they lack mental capacity. That's what's unfolding over here. So I'm sorry?
They couldn't write?
If somebody was deaf and mute, so the assumption is there was no way for them to learn anything. Even the ability to write, right, is a function of, in order to write, you have to be able to amass knowledge somehow. Otherwise, what are you writing? How did you learn to write it? So this is just reflecting a reality that ultimately someone who was deaf and mute had just no ability to absorb knowledge. And therefore, again, we're treated as someone who lacks mental capacity. Now, again, you have a cheresh hamedaber ve'eno shomea, right? So someone who doesn't hear but is able to speak, or someone who's able to speak but is unable to hear. So you have, and in halacha, those people often have capacity. It was this duality of deaf and mute that essentially made a person lacking legal capacity. Fine. Rabbi Yehuda says, but a katan can. So the Gemara says, Man tana cheresh ti'eved namilo. Who is the opinion that says that a cheresh, even b'di eved, cannot read the Megillah? Rav Masna, Rabbi Yossi, it's Rabbi Yossi Disnan. So which Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yossi from our Mishnah. What Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah say? Disnan. Hakori as Shema v'lo Shmi la'azno. If a person went ahead and read Shema, but he did not hear that which he was saying, Yatza, ultimately, again, he is Yotze, div Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you say Shema, but you don't hear the words that you're saying, you are still Yotze. Rabbi Yossi Omer Lo Yatza. Rabbi Yossi says you're not Yotze. So the idea, so what do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see that Rabbi Yossi holds that in order to be Yotzei Shema, you have to hear that which you are saying. And therefore, if you can't hear, by definition, Rabbi Yossi would say, you're not Yotzei. He would say, you're not Yotzei. And therefore, that would seem to be the opinion that says that by Megillah, if a cheresh who is deaf and mute would not be Yotzei with Mikra Megillah, would not be able to be Motzi to discharge the obligation of others. So the Gemara says, Mimayd Rabbi Yossi v'di Namilo. How do you know it's Rabbi Yossi? And even Bidi Evet he's referring to. We'll say Amud Beis, 15b. Dilma, Rabbi Yehuda hi ulechatchilahu delo hadi Evet shaber dami. Maybe it's reflecting the view of Rabbi Yehuda. And maybe what it means to say is like this, that ultimately, again, that a cheresh cannot lechatchila read the Megillah, but maybe Bidi Evet he can be Motzi somewhere. Maybe Bidi Evet he can be Yotzi. To which the Gemara says, no, because again, remember we're equating a cheresh to a shota and a katan. To teach me what? Ma shota v'katan di eved namilo. Just like a shota and a katan. Remember again, a shota, is actually interesting. What's the halachic definition of insanity? The halachic definition of insanity. So the Gemara gives an example of someone who is lon bebeis hakvaros, a person who sleeps in the cemetery, and tears his clothing for no reason. So actions that seem to defy any level of comprehension. So the Gemara is pointing out over here that we compare a cheresh to a shota and a katan. Ma shota v'katan di'eved namilo. Just like a shota and a katan, even b'di'eved, they can't go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah of Megillah, right? Because they lack mental capacity. Av cheresh di'eved namilo. So to a cheresh, even b'di'eved, it would not work. I v'dilma ha-kedisa v'ha-kedisa. Maybe not. Maybe each category is kind of reckoned separately and on its own. To which the Gemara says, "Mi matzis lo uchmak Rabbi Yehuda." But how can you even set the whole thing up like Rabbi Yehuda? V'hami diktani seifa Rabbi Yehuda machshir b'katan. Since the seifa, the end of the brayso read that Rabbi Yehuda Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a katan can read the Megillah. Mechlal dereisha lav Rabbi Yehuda. We can infer from this that the first part of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe the whole thing is Rabbi Yehuda. And that is actually very interesting. Utrei gavne katan. And maybe there are two different types of kitanim. In halacha, maybe there are two different categories of children. Namely what? There's something missing. And here's how you have to read the Mishnah. Listen to this. Hakol ksherin likros Megillah. So now the Gemara is trying to provide or put forward an alternate reading of the Mishnah. And here's how you read it. Hakol ksherin likros Megillah. Everyone is permitted, is kosher to read the Megillah. And I will say, just to be clear, I should have clarified this before. When we say Hakol ksherin likros Megillah, what we mean is everyone is permitted to read the Megillah and thereby satisfy their obligation and the obligation of others as well. Right? That's what it means to say that someone else is reading the Megillah. So everyone could read the Megillah and discharge the obligation of someone else with the following exceptions. Chutz, with the exception of cheresh, deaf mute, shota, someone who's insane, katan, and a child. So I'll say, now watch this. When it comes to children, however, there may be different categories of children. When is this so? That a child cannot fulfill the obligation of Megillah for himself and for others. This is a katan who has not reached the age of education. But a katan who has reached the age of education, so to speak, afilu lechatchila kosher Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi said this is really quite interesting, and we actually find this distinction in certain areas of halacha about a child who has reached the age of education. What do you mean the age of education? An age at which a child is able to absorb information and is able to take responsibility for their actions. So contemporarily, that's at about 30, right? That's a joke, right? So Lamaisa, there is this interesting idea. I'll give you an example of this. Tefillin. So we often associate that the mitzvah of tefillin is an obligation when you come bar mitzvah. The truth is, the mitzvah of tefillin is really, as soon as a child is capable of maintaining a clean body, they really should put on tefillin. They should put on tefillin. And it happens to be, we don't do this contemporarily because we sometimes just feel that children aren't capable of doing this. But this is an interesting example that once you reach what's called the age of chinuch, age of chinuch is probably like in halakha, like 7 or 8 years old, you have a certain level of halachic capacity. So Rabbi Yehuda, interestingly enough, makes a distinction between a child below the age of chinuch, of education, and a child above the age of chinuch. A child below the age of chinuch cannot read the Megillah, cannot be motzi anyone else, but a child above the age of chinuch perhaps can, which is a very interesting distinction. Again, we'll see exactly how he paskin like that. But we'll say first wide line on Tesval, first wide line 15b. Rabbi Yehuda machshir bekatan. As Rabbi Yehuda ultimately again says that a katan, in fact, is permitted to go ahead and do this. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, "B'mayu kimte, Rabbi Yehuda v'di eved in lechatchila lo." So we'll say, "So now have you set this up? You've set this up according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa b'di eved it works, but lechatchila it doesn't." Elahad tan Rabbi Yehuda b'rei Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, cheresh hamedaber ve'enu shomea torim lechatchila. So we'll say this is an interesting case. So what do you do about the following statement? Following statement made by Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, who says as follows: Cherish hamadar ben shomea. So remember again, this is a person who is deaf but not mute. Deaf but not mute. Cherish, right? Cherish hamedaber. He's able to speak. Ve'en shomea. He can't hear. So what's the halacha? Torim lechatchila. He could separate out truma lechatchila. So Rabbi says, this is an interesting, good. Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says over here, I'll read it to Rashi. It says, Ve'lohadetani torim, ve'afapi shutzarech levarech, ve'ein oznov shomos. So this is interesting. When you separate out truma, so there's a bracha. There's a bracha that one has to say. Now obviously, if we're talking about a person who is deaf, but can speak, that means he can articulate the bracha, but what? But what? He won't hear it. He won't hear it. Yet, the halacha is, he is permitted to go ahead and separate out truma, l'chatchila, which tells you that what? Which tells you that what? That there's the ability to say something, right, and discharge a verbal obligation, even if what? Even if you can't hear it. Even if you can't hear it. Okay, so the Gemara says, money. Whose opinion does that reflect? So listen to this. Lo Rabbi Huda, v'lo Rabbi Yossi. It's neither Rabbi Huda nor is it Rabbi Yossi. Why? I Rabbi Huda, the evet in lechatchila. If it's Rabbi Huda will say that lechatchila, whenever you have a verbal obligation, you have to be able to hear that which you are saying. Bidi evet, if you don't, you yotze. So therefore, but yet this Bryce over here is quoting that a person who's deaf could go ahead and separate out truma, make the bracha even lechatchila. So can't do Rabbi Yehuda. I Rabbi Yossi di eved namilo. And if it's Rabbi Yossi holds that even b'di eved, you always have to be able to hear whatever verbal declaration you are making. Elamai Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, it has to be Rabbi Yehuda. Va'afiu lechatchila nami. And it must be again. Rabbi Yehuda holds that even lechatchila, even if you can't hear that which you are articulating, you could still be yotze. So we'll say, so just before we go on, just in general, what's happening over here? So what's happening over here is an overarching machlokes about when there is a verbal obligation, do you have to hear the articulation of that verbal obligation or not? Now remember, where did all of this get started? This all got started where? In our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah discuss? There's an obligation to say Shema. And I will say, I want to point out, here's what's interesting, which is, remember, the halacha by Shema is you can't scan Shema with your eyes. Right? That's not enough. You have to actually articulate the words. So the shaila is, do you have to hear that articulation or not? So this is our ongoing machlokes. Remember again, in our Mishnah, just one more time back to our Mishnah, say in our Mishnah we have Rabbi Yossi telling me, we have the first opinion of the Mishnah telling me that ultimately, again, you're Yotze. We'll call him the Tanakama telling us that we're Yotze. Rabbi Yossi telling us that we're not Yotze. All we're doing is we're bringing that machlokes now into other areas of halacha as well. So let's give another example of this. Elohad Isanya. So we'll say I am on 15b. 15b in the wide lines, 5 lines in. Elohad Isanya, listen to this. Lo yivarich adam berachos hamazon b'libo. Interesting case. You can't bench, not by heart, but bench in your heart, right? In your heart, right? Which essentially means like you can't scan it. You can't scan bench. But if you did it, you're yotze. So once again, whose opinion is this? So money. Lo Rabbi Huda, lo Rabbi Yossi. It's neither Rabbi Huda nor is it Rabbi Yossi. Why not? I Rabbi Huda. If it's Rabbi Huda, ha'amar afil lechatchila nami. Remember again, Rabbi Huda, I will say, is the Tanakama. Rabbi Huda is the first opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Huda holds that in general, wherever there is a verbal obligation, you need not hear that which you are saying. So according to Rabbi Huda, even lechatchila, if you just want to articulate the words of benching without hearing them, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. So v'i Rabbi Yossi according to Rabbi Yossi is that whenever there's a verbal obligation, you have to be able to hear that which you are articulating. To which the Gemara says, Lo li olam Rabbi Hudahi. It's really Rabbi Huda. V'afil lechatchila nami. And ultimately, again, it turns out that Rabbi Huda's position is, even lechatchila, when you have a verbal obligation, you need not hear that which you are articulating. So the Gemara says, V'lo kasha, hadidei hadrabe. And it could very well be that what's happening over here is Rabbi Huda himself is actually articulating 2 positions. One is his own position, and one is his Rebbe's position. The Sanyo, I'm Rabbi Huda, Mishum Rebbe Lazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Huda said the name of Rebbe Lazar ben Azariah, HaKori Eshma, Sarech Sheyashmiya la'azno. When a person says Shema, you have to hear that which you are saying. Shnei Amar, Shema Yisrael. Pasuk says Shema Yisrael. Here. So remember again, this is Rabbi Huda quoting his Rebbe, Rebbe Lazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, when you say Shema, you have to hear exactly what you're saying. Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said back to him, Harehu Omer, Asher Nochi Mitzad Chayim Al Levavecha. But the pasuk says, when referring to Shema, that I command you today on your heart, which teaches you what? Achar kavanas halev hein advarim. So the Gemara says again. So Rabbi Meir says, Alev avecha teaches you that what? That even if you just say Shema, so to speak, in your heart, without explicitly articulating or saying it in a way that could be heard by the ears, that you're still Yotzei. So the Gemara says, Hasht. So therefore, again, we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Rabbi Yehuda himself, there are two positions attributed to him. There's Rabbi Yehuda's own position and his Rebbe's position. His Rebbe's position was that l'chatchila, ultimately, again, you have to go ahead and hear that which you are saying. That which you are saying, but b'di eved, you don't. Rabbi Yehuda's own position was, even b'di eved, you have to. Even b'di eved, you have to. And then there's another school of thought that says, no, you don't have to hear anything at all. Okay, that's the machlokas. So the Gemara says, Hashta da asas lahachi. Now that we've come to this explanation that Rabbi Yehuda himself, there's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe's opinion. Afilutim Rabbi Yehuda kirabei sirale. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda even holds like his Rebbe. V'lo kashya ha Rabbi Yehuda ha Rabbi Meir. Maybe the two different opinions that we were focusing on before. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. So both say. So bottom line, what comes down from this whole sugya, what's really quite interesting is this Mishnah, our Mishnah, which is focused on Shema. When you say Shema, do you have to go ahead and hear the words? In other words, do you have to recite Shema in an audible tone or not? Tanakama says you do not have to. Rabbi Yossi says you do have to. Now that we see is that this is not just a machlokes by Shema. This is a machlokes that applies in many different areas of halacha. Whenever there is a verbal obligation, is there a need to articulate it in an audible fashion or not? Now, what is interesting is, what seems to come out is, what everyone will agree with is that whenever there's a verbal obligation, so simply going ahead and scanning something with your eyes, that's never going to work. That's interesting, right? So the machlokes is only, again, what level of audibility is required. But simple scanning is not going to work. Okay, interesting idea. We're not finished yet. Amar Rav Shila, Halacha Rabbi Yehuda, Sha'amar Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So ultimately, again, so Rabbi Chis says in Rav Shila that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, who said over in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So remember again, that's what we just quoted before. That namely, that when you say Shema, you have to hear that which you are saying. Right? Hakori Shema, Hakori es Hashma tzarich she'yashmi'a la'azno. So now you have Rabbi Chista saying that that's the halacha. V'halacha Rabbi Yehuda, and the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda as well. So they both said that seems to be a bit redundant. So the Gemara says it's tricha. You need both statements. Why? Tiashmo inan halacha Rabbi Yehuda. If the Gemara just says halacha Rabbi Yehuda, hava min afil lechatchila. I would have thought that even lechatchila you have to hear that which you are articulating. Kamash malan. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda Sham Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. V'yashmin halacha Rabbi Yehuda Sham Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And if we would have just told the statement that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, who said in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Havamina Tzarich ve'in lo takana. I might have thought ultimately again you need it, but there is no remedy. Kamash malan halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, again the Gemara goes out of its way to tell me that halacha lemaisa, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, namely that although the chatchila you are supposed to be able to hear everything that you say, or Shema, for example, but b'di eved, if you did not do so, ultimately again you are yotzei. Okay, so I'll just point out over here. That just the halacha is we paskin like the Tanakama, and therefore again we paskin like Korei Shema v'lo Shmiya la'azno yatsa. Ideally, when saying Shema, you should say Shema in an audible of enough tone that you're able to hear the words that you're actually saying. But b'di eved, if you didn't do that, let's say again, a lot of times people daven like this, where I'm saying the words, but there's no sound. You are yotzei. So that is the bottom. So ideally, chatchila, say it in an audible enough tone that you could hear the words. B'di eved, you're still yotzei, even if you just, what's the word? I guess like mouth the words, right? Without, I'm sorry? Articulate, right? So in other words, there's articulation, but there's no sound. So b'di eved, you're yotzi like that as well. Okay.
Just the first pasuk.
just...
You don't have to hear the rest of Shema. You also have all three parshas.
So the Mishnah Berurah brings down that ideally, it's best to say all of Shema in somewhat of an audible undertone. But yes, but this halacha that we're talking about over here is the first pasuk. That is correct.
And that's the same as scanning with your eyes,
No. So scanning with your eyes is nothing. Right? Scanning with your eyes is nothing. That's even like Devarim Shebalev. That's not... Now again, there are some things you could do with scanning. Like anything that doesn't have... Like for example, you have this sometimes where, generally most shuls, Psukei de Zimra goes pretty quickly. Right? So a lot of times people can't necessarily keep up with Psukei de Zimra. So, technically speaking, if one were to scan Psukei de Zimra with their eyes, technically that's okay. But for example, Ashrei, where there's a din of Amira, anytime that there's a din of saying something, you have to articulate it, even if there's no sound, like a bracha, right? You can't scan a bracha. You have to say a bracha. But if you made a bracha, ideally the way to make a bracha is with sound. But if you just articulated the words with no sound, technically you're Yotzei.
Sometimes you hear things in your head, no? Like Beethoven could hear music in his head. Like some people actually hear the words as they...
You mean...
They're not scanning, they're actually hearing the words, but they're not...
But they're not moving their lips. Yeah, I still think in halacha there is an obligation of articulation. Yeah, I don't think scanning, even if you're hearing it, although if you're hearing stuff in your head, we should have other conversations. Right? There might be other stuff going on, but no, I don't think. I think what's coming out according to the halacha is simply scanning, even if you're hearing it in your mind, is not going to be enough. All right, so let's go a little bit weiter. So the Gemara says as follows. We also have another minute. So let's go. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Yosef, machlokes b'kriyas Shema. So Rabbi Yosef is interesting. So Rabbi Yosef says the machlokes is only by Shema. Aval b'shar mitzvos, but by all other mitzvos, divrei hakol lo yatsa. So this is interesting. Rabbi Yosef says this machlokes as to whether or not you need audibility with your recitation is only a machlokes by Shema. But for all other mitzvos, where there is an obligation of articulation, if there's no sound associated with that, then ultimately, again, you're not Yotzi. Now, why is that? D'chsev haskes u'shema Yisrael. Because the pasuk says, literally again, be attentive, u'shema Yisrael. So we'll say, so we'll have to see exactly what that pasuk. Take a look. Good. So let's see. Haskisu Shema Yisrael. So we'll have to see exactly what that statement means. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, lo yivarich adam birchas hamazon belibo. Person shouldn't bench in his heart. Vim beirach yotza. But if he did so, ultimately again he's yotzei. So we'll say, so that seems to contradict what we just said before. Because before we just said the only machlokes ultimately again is by Shema. But by all other mitzvos, everyone agrees that there has to be audibility connected with your articulation. So yet here we're seeing that halacha l'maisa, again, a person could bench, and even if they didn't say anything, right, that they're still yotzei. Ela'i itmar hachi itmar. That's what you have to say. Amrav Yosef, machlokes b'kriyas Shema, d'chsiv Shema Yisrael. So I will say, the whole machlokes is by Shema. Why is all machlokes by Shema? Because it says Shema Yisrael. So the shaila is, what does that mean, Shema Yisrael? What does that mean? Does that mean to hear, in other words, that you have to recite whatever you're saying with a degree of audibility? Is that what it means? Or does it mean ultimately, again, all I have to do is articulate it, but I don't necessarily have to hear it? Aval b'shar mitzvos, but again, when it comes to other mitzvos, divrei hakol yatsa. Everyone agrees, ultimately, again, that if you recited it, but there was no sound associated with it, that you would still be yotzei. But the pasuk says, haskes u'shema Yisrael, but it says, be attentive and listen, Klal Yisrael. Hahu b'divrei Torah ksiv. Interesting enough, the Gemara says, that's actually talking about Torah. Rashi says over here, Hahu haskes u'shema b'divrei Torah ksiv, kida amrino perak haroa, so we'll say it's interesting. The haskes ushma, the Gemara wants to suggest, is not even a din in listening, but rather, again, it's a din ultimately of literally, again, like, what's the right word? kises, like pounding oneself into a sense of submission in the performance of Torah and mitzvahs. All right, well, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up. We're going to pick up with the sugya tomorrow. Do a bit more halacha lamaisa with this as well. But bottom line, what comes out is we see a fundamental machlokes that whenever there is an obligation, ultimately again to say something, does there have to be a measure of audibility associated with it as well? We paskin that by kriyas shema, although ideally you're supposed to hear that which you are saying, Bidi Evet, if you didn't, you are still Yotze. By other mitzvot, Semiras Hashem, we'll see a bit more tomorrow. Shkoyach.